So modern life is built on promises, right? Our work life, our romantic life, our family life, our social life. Whether we're doing business with a stranger on the other side of the world, or with a friend sitting next to us, we rely on the promises that others make about what they'll do next. And our digital lives, too, are built on promises. Promises about how this technology will change your life, or who will maintain that code, or what will happen to our data. These promises are hard to keep. Organizations making them can have a change of heart or a change of fortune. WhatsApp gets bought and decides it's in the advertising business now. iRobot decides that now isn't the time to sell the data that your Roomba makes as it zips around your apartment, but it might be later. A cancer research facility in Boston goes under, and 10 years' worth of research is incinerated. So part of the problem here is that we're tying promises about technology, about code, about things, to the financial health of organizations, to business models that could fail or change. But even governments can change their promises and disappear scientific data from the internet. Most new organizations fail. Most open source projects fail, at a rate of about 80%. So 80% of new organizations will fail and take their technology with them. 80% of new open source projects fail. And that's okay. Things fail. Technology goes obsolete, businesses go under, people change their mind, things fall apart, stuff happens. I'm not here to say that we're going to stop organizations from failing. I'm here to talk about how we can deal with these failures and how we can be better. So, my name is Porcaro. I'm a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center, and I'm working on a project called Digital Public. And today I'm going to talk about how we handle failure. Because right now, we're not great at it. Our way of handling failure is to sort of ignore it. Failure is a thing that happens to other people, or failure is just another stepping stone on the road to success. And here, when I'm talking about technology failing, I'm not really talking about all technology or all software or all code. Move fast and break things is fine if you're a bike-sharing startup, or if you're making quizzes about which Hogwarts house you belong in. I'm a Ravenclaw myself. I'm talking about public interest technology. Technology that solves a social problem or a civic problem or supports public research. In other words, something where we're using technology as a means, as a tool to keep a promise about a social mission or a social movement. And here, move fast and break things is less okay. We often talk about how technology can solve some problem, and there's a nice, appealing story to this. We have a problem, just add technology, and then the problem is fixed. The story doesn't always end there, right? Public interest technology creates dependencies. Communities depend on these projects, on code, on data, in order to keep these solutions alive. Whether we're trying to mitigate the effects of climate change, or cure cancer, or use software to deliver government services, or use data to help local fishermen maintain industry, or building software to help translators subtitle videos. We're trying really hard to keep these promises and keep these projects alive. But all the evidence says that these promises will be broken. We promise we won't sell your data unless we change our mind. This research will be publicly accessible until the administration changes. This technology will keep working as long as the government keeps paying the contractor. And then something changes. And these broken promises have real harm if we don't prepare for them. So before coming to Berkman, I worked at a nonprofit and worked with technology. And I saw technology for social good projects come and go. And when they did, what happened to their data was often a mystery, leaving their missions to sort of twist in the wind. So on the one hand, we aren't going to prevent failures from happening. But on the other hand, these projects, this data, this code, is valuable to the public, to communities. So what can we do? We can improve, I think, our stewardship of the data and code that really matters, from massive joint research projects to the data and code that a single organization generates. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. How can we be better stewards in an uncertain digital world? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing around data trusts. It's a model for digital stewardship, from helping find public interest technology projects new homes to facilitating data and technology sharing across sort of siloed organizations. I'll explain what all that means in a minute. But first, I want to talk about two ways that we deal with technology failure now and why it just isn't good enough. The first is open sourcing. When organizations decide to stop supporting a project, they tend to open source it, which usually means they put the code up on GitHub with a license that says anybody can use or modify it. If you're lucky, you might get some documentation too. This feels a little bit like abandoning a project on a desert island in the middle of the ocean. Technically, anybody can come and access it, but they probably won't. Don't get me wrong, open source software is great. I use it every day. My computer runs Linux right now. But that doesn't mean that open sourcing is great for every project. Technology is hard, and even well-supported projects are difficult to maintain. Linux, maybe the best supported open source software in the world, takes an average of 5 years to fix bugs in its kernel. And even well-maintained projects may not be well-supported. OpenSSL is software for secure web communications that's used on the majority of the world's web servers. You may have heard of it because of the Heartbleed bug, a security vulnerability that affected every web server that was running it. Again, a majority of web servers in the world. Before this bug, OpenSSL, the project, had one full-time employee and averaged about $2,000 a year in donations. And these are the popular projects. A study of SourceForge through 2009 said of the 150,000 or so open source projects on it, just 1 in 6 got to a first release. GitHub, in the meantime, has tens of millions of repositories, 25 million that were updated in 2017, and another 20 million that haven't been updated in over a year. So just saying that we're going to open source it may not be the best thing for the project. For a maintainer to find your project, it might be like, well, trying to find a desert island in the middle of the ocean. And in the case of public interest technology, abandoning a project to the public domain may not be in the best interest of the project's mission. The people who depend on a project and the people who maintain a project are different. They have different skills. And they aren't looking in the same places for help. And so without somebody supporting it, an organization, a group, a person, it may be hard for an organization who actually needs the project to use it. It feels to me a little bit like abandoning a seeing eye dog on a desert island and hoping that blind people will just sort of come along. So hoping that the public runs with a failed technology project isn't a great option either. The second way that we deal with failure is we're closing data up. We build regulations to promote innovation and protect people from data breaches, and we should. But that means that organizations build data forts to protect their IP and to avoid liability. In other words, we're staying on our islands and we're building walls around them. And this warps the relationship that we have with data in strange ways. It means that organizations who hold the most data will be the ones who can afford liability risks, and that makes collaboration hard. It's more difficult for organizations to collaborate on things like biomedical research, or for local governments to collaborate on technology procurement. It took a massive breach of trust on Facebook for the company to even agree to work with researchers and academics in the first place, and who knows how long that will last. So by filtering data through these forts, we're sort of bypassing our opportunity to build independent relationships with the communities of the people that we're actually researching. And these relationships online are really filtered through these business relationships. So the public domain may not be the best place for a project, but locking it away isn't doing it any better. So our work focuses on stewardship. In other words, as we're doing more and more, how can we ensure that promises about data and code are kept? How can we prevent undesired uses? Can we build safeguards that let us use sensitive data that we might not have had access to before? And how can we give communities voice about what happens to their data? And again, we're doing this because data and technology is valuable. We're collecting and creating more and more of it is sensitive, and we have the ability to use it for more and more varied applications. Whew. And when these projects fail, there are more and more severe consequences for the communities who rely on them. Put it another way, we're rewriting relationships between people and organizations and governments based on data and code. The frameworks for managing these relationships are quickly growing obsolete. So we need new tools to handle these digital relationships. And trusts might be one of them. OK, so onto the good stuff. We're saying that we're trying to create stewardship. How can we do that? How can we do that right now? In law, there's something called a fiduciary. Basically, it's when someone has a legal duty to take care of something on behalf of somebody else. So your lawyer has a fiduciary duty to you as a client. A company has a fiduciary duty to shareholders. A lot of times, these duties regulate how a profession works. Legal scholars Jonathan Zittrain and Jack Balkin have suggested that this is kind of one path to regulating companies that hold lots of personal data. So if you say that Facebook has a legally enforceable duty not just to its shareholders, but to its users, to the people whose data they hold. This is kind of an interesting idea, right? That somebody could have a legal duty to take care of something on behalf of somebody else. And there are lots of examples of that that come from government fiat. But we can also form these duties privately with a trust. So a trust is a legal agreement, a way to own something for the benefit of somebody else. Trust starts with a grantor. A grantor has an asset, money, code, data, whatever. A grantor writes a trust document to put an asset in trust, essentially declaring that it is so and it is in the trust. And this trust document has a couple of ingredients. Obviously, it has to say what the asset actually is, the thing that we're holding in trust is. Without the asset, there's no trust. It also has to designate beneficiaries, right? A person, a group of people, the public in the case of a charitable trust. In other words, it has to answer, who is this asset intended to benefit? Who is it for? It has to designate a trustee. This is the person of the organization responsible for taking care of the asset on behalf of the beneficiaries. And finally, we have to articulate the trust duties. How should the trustee steward and steer this asset? And depending on where we are, we can customize these duties to fit the needs of our specific project. In fact, we can customize kind of a lot here within this triangle of duties, trustee, and beneficiary. We could even do something kind of crazy, like give the trustee a board of directors, or have community elections, or have multiple trustees. In other words, this is a really useful framework for sussing out what duties we ought to have about something and to whom those duties are owed. And so we see this framework kind of a lot. Charities are often organized as trusts. In the UK, civic trusts are used to help communities manage local resources. In the US, land trusts aren't trusts in the strict legal sense, but they're managed by a third party and based on sort of conservation easements. But they're borrowing from this basic structure. There's a trustee, there are duties, and a beneficiary to help preserve and conserve land. So as we're thinking about protecting public interest technology projects and making data sharing easier, we might start thinking about how we could build on a structure like this. So, all right, how can we use it as a way to deal with failure or transition? Something better than abandoning a project on a desert island. In a way, it sort of feels like estate planning for a technology project. So we might write a trust that says, the goal of this trust is to help find a new caretaker for this such and such software that continues its mission in the event that the current organization goes under, abandons the project, and sells out, et cetera. So how would we put this trust together? We need an asset, which might be a copy of the project, along with an unlimited license to use it. And of course, technology projects change, so we might need to upload that asset to a trustee's server and update it from time to time. We need to be able to articulate beneficiaries, who this project is supposed to be for. And we need a trustee with duties, somebody who would hold a copy of this project in, say, cold storage, and then find a new home for it if something went wrong. So for a charity running a technology project, right, this looks a little bit like insurance, but for your mission. And it could be relatively inexpensive. OK, so we can use a trust as a way to protect a project's mission and do our best to find it a new home in the event that something goes wrong. And this could make something else that's kind of cool. So if I'm a trustee who has one of these trusts, right, I might need a way to find new organizations to take on a project and vet those who are interested in it. Because as a trustee, I'm duty-bound to protect the beneficiaries and continue the project's mission. And so I might start soliciting applications for adopting the projects so that I can vet requests and ensure that the organization taking over will, keep their promises. And if I manage more than one of these trusts, I might set up something like a hub for adopting these new projects. And this might be a better place for organizations to come and help pick up technology projects where they left off. And this idea, right, that a trustee could solicit and process applications for data and code is actually kind of interesting on its own, right? So we could have a data set or a code base managed by a trustee who's obligated to protect and support a community. And that trustee could decide which outside requests for that data are going to be fulfilled. So this sounds like a potentially useful and interesting structure for governing data sharing between people who have data and people who need it, especially when we aren't sure who's going to be requesting that data up front. In fact, the UK government is using a similar structure like this in order to start thinking about how they can govern AI and the data that it needs. We could also think about this from a social science research perspective, right? So there's a wealth of data on poverty prevention, on the effectiveness of legal assistance, on how people move through government services that are hiding in the data sets of charities and social service organizations. But this data is also really sensitive. So surfacing those insights might require some kind of trusted intermediary who could approve or deny requests while ensuring client anonymity and enforcement against bad actors. We could keep building on this idea. So if trusts are a way to help build relationships between data providers and data requesters, it doesn't have to be just one provider and one requester. We could help collaboratives, groups of organizations, find ground for sharing code and technology. So in the US, local governments are contributing code to a trust in order to help improve technology behind local elections. And in a field like, say, cancer research, where there are universities and startups and large corporations, all with different data protection standards in different countries, a trust could be a way to resolve all of these a little bit more easily. It could also make a framework like this greedy, so that if somebody takes data out and uses it to develop something else, they have to put the results of their research back into the trust. And far be it from me or anybody to hold themselves out as a GDPR expert. But for organizations worried about sharing data with US companies, right, a trust could be this sort of intermediary vehicle for enforcing third-party data processing. And so if we were to really go crazy, in the UK, there are some cities have civic trusts. They're volunteer organizations with missions that center around protecting civic life and influencing the planning of their city. So we might think about a digital civic trust as a way to empower communities to decide what happens to their data, with a digital public advocate backing it. So in a nutshell, these are the things that we're trying to do at Digital Public. We're trying to connect together this archipelago of isolated data and technology projects. We're trying to keep mission-driven technology projects alive and make sharing data easier. And so Cosway, our platform to help stewarding public interest technology with trusts, will be ready later this year. We'll make it easier for organizations to secure their project's mission and help set up structures to share sensitive data. So the last part of this presentation, I want to close by sort of zooming out a little bit. I said at the beginning of this that we aren't very good about facing the idea that technology, or really anything, may fail. It's not just technology, right? We're bad at confronting risk head-on with intention. In other fields, we try to account for that. We set up rules and guidelines and frameworks and insurance, and we do all this before something goes wrong and not after. And these rules and these guidelines and these frameworks change how we behave. And they change habits. And so what I'm saying is that we need to prepare for the change that we might see in the world. And because technology is rewriting our relationships with each other, with governments, with companies, the idea of public service, and we need new frameworks for grappling with these relationships. This trust is one. It may not be the best framework for everything all the time, but that isn't our goal. Our goal is to help people and organizations and governments reconcile with these new digital relationships and build governance frameworks that are suited to their mission and purpose. So whether it's a trust or a contract or a license, these are foundations, the rules of a game. Digital relationships are built, digital cultures are built on how people behave, on what people understand, on what duties people owe to each other, on what people value. And these relationships, these cultures of data, are going to evolve on their own. And we're just trying to help nudge them in the right direction. And so there's an interesting design challenge here for us, right? Is how do we help people plan for failure, to think about stewardship, to think about governance, to consider their mission, without asking them to become lawyers or data scientists or programmers, right? I think it requires us to think a little bit differently about how we're building software. Right? We need to help people understand the rules of digital relationships and what their rights are. And so our goal when we're writing software isn't just to improve somebody's experience and make it delightful. It should be to improve their understanding. So for the most part, this goes against how software is designed. Most of the websites that we use online have two elements in common. One is kind of a slot machine interface. So you type something into a form, you hit a button, and you get something random back. And then you might do it again. And there's nothing to really help you connect the thing that you put in with the thing you get back. Government feels a little bit like this too, right? We send off a form and we wait, and then we get something back, and then we might have to fill out another form, and then we wait, and then we might get something back, or we might not. The second thing that we deal with here is sort of a novella of legalese, right? So trying to understand the rules of your relationship with a service is meant to be as difficult as possible. So you have two choices. You can either ignore it and hope for the best, or get lots of training in how law and technology works so you can understand what's going on. That's expensive. And this is just kind of what we're used to, right? It doesn't actually have to be this way. I think there's a better way, and we're sort of interested in finding it. So one place that we're looking for inspiration is game design. Will Wright, the creator of SimCity, talks about how when you're introducing a player to a game this complicated, it's so complicated that you can't just dump everything on somebody, or they'll be totally lost. So the beginning of the game focuses on helping people build this sort of simple mental model of what's going on in the world. It might be wrong, it might be incomplete, but it gives people a toehold and a way to sort of bootstrap a progressive understanding of the world. And so part of what we're trying to figure out is, how do we help people build these intermediate understandings of the world, even if it's wrong? So maybe a piece of it is making language that's simpler to understand, or using icons to help people keep track of abstract concepts. And maybe another piece is taking advantage of the fact that online we're working in an interactive medium. So rather than a slot machine, we can make explanations that are interactive, where people can play with the settings and see how things change. And maybe this won't be enough, or not everybody will use them, or not everybody will care. That's okay. The fact is, people are forming mental models about this technology anyway. Every interaction that you have with a piece of software, with a bureaucracy, or a form, changes your understanding about how it works. Right? We build models about the world all the time, constantly, without knowing it. And so if we're trying to empower people to take control of their data and of the technology that they depend on, shouldn't we be helping them become experts, just a little bit at a time? In sociology, there's a theory of social movements that says that a movement is an ongoing dialogue, a negotiation, a way for people to agree on a common meaning for words and ideas. So in that sense, we're trying to build a digital stewardship movement as best we can by trying to help people understand what that might mean for them. We're developing model trusts and model modules, right? Little Lego blocks for people to understand piecemeal and then fit together. And we're doing research to find out how people think about data and code and how they value it, and what their sort of intermediate understanding of the rules actually are. And we're working on interactive explanations to help people understand the peculiarities of some of the legal structures that we're throwing at them. Our goal at the end of the day is to make digital stewardship more accessible and more participatory, not just for experts, but for everybody. And as data is more and more a part of our everyday lives, and as our public spaces are becoming digital as much as they are physical, the decisions that we make about how we govern them are ever more important. And that's really the challenge that underlies all of this, is how can we build a participatory digital society that's really worthy of people's trust? We think it's a challenge worth chasing. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. So we're going to do questions now. Yeah, if you keep it on, and I'll repeat the questions after they're asked, so for the cameras.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought you were going to stall. That's a good stalling technique too.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Why use a data trust rather than a data repository?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is that it's not really an either-or, right? Like a data trust, what we're focused on here is sort of how decisions are made about what happens to that data. And so, here there might be some assurance in a data repository if it's government-backed, right? But if it's not government-backed or if the administration changes, there's sort of additional whims that it might be privy to. And so you might think about this for a data repository. They might use a data trust for something like archival purposes, right? So there's sort of a backup to the backup. And that trust is only activated when, if something catastrophic happened to the repository.
Do you have any other examples of companies using UX for Legalese?
There aren't many great examples. The banner one that I used to use for a long time, and I don't know if it's still true, was Tumblr did a really good job of explaining their terms of service in sort of like regular human sentences. But then the problem with that, right, is that you see there's this sort of, we'll explain what this means, and then at the bottom you're like, by the way, this doesn't actually, none of these other human sentences mean anything about what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And if you misunderstand it, it's just sort of too bad for you. So it's, companies, I think, aren't really focusing on it. I think where you're seeing a lot of interesting things happen is in government and in public service. And the reason, I think, is that if you're a company, when we talk about design for a company, what you're really talking about is sort of designing your user base, right? You're designing something that people, some group of people, but not everybody, will look at intuitively, right? And with government and with public service and with charities, they can't pick their user base, right? They've got to be accessible to everybody. And so that allows for a few more interesting things, but it's hard.
How do you decide who's going to be a data steward?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like asking how are you going to decide who you're going to sign a contract with, right? So I think that it will be kind of communities that will eventually have to sort of pick this. But what I'm also suggesting, maybe implicitly, is that there's sort of maybe a new professional class brewing, right, of people who have these skills to be sort of data stewards. And I don't really know what the sort of beginnings of that might look like. You might sort of look at the beginnings of banking or the beginnings of law or the beginnings of specialized professions, and they get off to kind of rocky starts. There's a kind of old adage, right, about how regulations tend to be written in blood, something horrible tends to happen, and then we decide how to fix it. And I'm not quite sure that we've hit that moment yet. I don't know if that quite gets to your question, but. So one of the examples that I gave here is a bunch of state governments in the US. So in the US, elections are administered at a local level, not at a national level. And so each state is sort of responsible for its own election infrastructure, which is exactly as much of a mess as you might think it would be. There is an organization called Democracy Works that works with a bunch of kind of state election officials, and they do a bunch of different things. They are working with state governments to set up a trust where they're the sort of trustee this nonprofit is. And all of the state governments are who sign up for this trust are putting their sort of election tech into the trust. And the role of the nonprofit then is to sort of be the steward. So they'll maintain the software, they'll keep it up, they'll manage the sort of membership, and then everybody will get the product of that back out again. And so for state governments who have a lot of restrictions about open sourcing software or about how to dispose of software or how to dispose of an asset, this is really convenient for them. And because they're also not very good or don't have very good resources with procurement, it's a useful way for them to get technology. And then for the community, it's a useful way to sort of not have to reinvent the wheel all the time. So it's not a, I think in almost all the examples that we've worked through with people, there has to be somebody in the community who's kind of able to step into that role, right? Like this isn't going to be a good structure where there's sort of an absence of expertise at some level. This may be a good structure for bridging expertise from an adjacent field, but it's not a substitute.
Thoughts around the UK government's use of data trusts?
So I think on the use of data trust, it's relatively early in the game. I think that most of what I've seen out of the UK government is focused on industries that are not quite nascent yet, right? So the convenient thing about saying we're going to regulate AI is that there's nobody on the other side to complain about the regulation of AI. I think we'll see how that actually gets put into practice. I think with something like the NHS data sets, and I don't know very much about it, so if I go totally off base, you can fill me in with more context. But it strikes me that the challenge with really large data sets like that is basically getting additional consent for the things that you'd like to do to it. And I think that there's nothing inherent about a legal structure of a trust that would make that go any faster, right? Like it's still a lot of data. It's a lot of consent to get. I do think that what it does provide is sort of a vehicle to do that, right? So in the same way that like NHS or government or corporations are organized in kind of like data governance really means like compliance, and that really means preventing data breaches, right? There's not sort of anybody who is set up as an intermediary to help researchers, for instance. And so this might be a sort of a place where you could put those resources and make that happen. But I don't know that there's anything sort of particular about the structure that would make that go faster.
Just asking if there's a place for blockchain within data trusts.
I think that they're sort of apples and like wheelchairs, right? A little bit. So like you could see the governance of a decentralized organization live in a trust, right? But as you start kind of getting closer and closer to there is somebody who has legal duties who is responsible for this thing, right? The closer and closer you get to what looks like a lot like just a centralized organization, like a company anyway, right? Like if the thing about blockchain is that we'd like if everybody had a copy of the database living on their computer or their machine, and like it needed to be good about keeping up to date, right? Like those are the solutions that I think blockchain is really good at. The solutions that trusts are really good at is how do we help organizations sort of deal with risk and deal with creating sort of expertise for maintenance in the event of failure. So I have other complaints about blockchain, but that's after a couple of years, so it's fine. It's a good question. I think there are two pieces to it, right? There's one piece around sort of success stories, and the second piece around financial incentives. So the first piece, you're right. There are successful examples. They're good examples. I think that my argument isn't that this is a replacement, right? It's that when a project gets open sourced and then gets picked up again, right? It's a little bit like whether that happens is sort of like a lottery ticket, right? We tend to read a lot about the people who win the lottery, but we don't read as much about the people who don't. And so I think this is kind of a complementary step. I'm not saying don't open source it, put it in a trust. I'm saying that what an organization might do is open source it and also put it in a trust to make sure that somebody is taking it forward. And so I think to your point about markets, the reason that I'm talking about it in the terms of public interest, I don't think a company would care about a trust. I think that might be a violation of bankruptcy law anyway, is that like we form charities, we form public services because there's some kind of market failure, right? And there's some kind of, and especially when you're working with nonprofits or with specialized communities, they might not have that sort of technical expertise, and there might not be that right match of capital and talent and need. And that might come eventually, but it seems like bad form to wait for it, right? Like the market is efficient, but it's not always efficient on time, if that makes sense.
How do you make sure the right projects get the trustee?
It's a good question. You try really hard. This is. I think I would frame this as a product a little bit like insurance in that case, right? Like, not everybody has it. It's helpful in the event that you need it. Yeah, it's about this is about kind of another tool to catch what falls through the cracks.
How does this translate into the real world?
I think the translation is that it's already happening. So what I'm talking about isn't a new legal structure. It's actually one of the oldest legal structures in the world. Its origin, I think, is horrifically during the Crusades, when people who held land in the UK were going off to fight. They left their land in the care of somebody, a trustee, who was sort of their agent, and their goal was, or their duty was to care for it on behalf of somebody else. And so really what we're doing here is adapting a structure that's already being used to care for land, to care for other people's money, to care for kind of a range of assets, and adding a couple of tweaks to say that we should use it for digital assets. And so in terms of enforcement, really you've got kind of similar rights in a court of law if you really need to do it. Like, a trust isn't going to prevent your sort of disaster like argument or lawsuit from being a mess. Like, it's just going to sort of frame the mess in a different way than a contract might have or bankruptcy might have. Yeah, so the question is there a risk that a trustee will kind of not serve the community's best interest or make decisions that withhold data from the community? Is that a fair representation of it?
Yeah.
Okay. There's totally a risk, right? You're dealing with people. Sometimes people are bad at things. In trust law, what you would do is sort of take advantage of sort of the mechanisms of trust law, which is that a beneficiary of a trust, so a member of that community, can challenge the decision of a trustee in chancery court. And so that's what you would expect somebody to do, right? And if there were really lots of if this was a sort of a pattern of behavior, then you start going after the trustee for dereliction of duty, and then for breaching their fiduciary duty, and then you try and find a new trustee. So the nice part about it is that it sort of makes it not easy, but it makes it relatively straightforward to swap out a new trustee if it turns out that that's what you need. But it's totally a risk. I don't yet have a legal device to prevent people from acting poorly. Question is about sort of the internationalization of this concept. I was just going to wait how long you'd stand up here. This is like a side note for like law and nerdery. In the US and the UK are what's called common law jurisdictions. And the idea of a trust is based on the idea that like ownership in something is actually a series of like rights that you can separate out. So like I can have the ability to control something and like own it, but I also have the ability to benefit from it. And you can split those two things up. In civil law countries like France and Spain and Italy, that concept doesn't exist. And so the idea of trusts doesn't really exist, but it's kind of getting there, because the sort of, again, benefit of piggybacking on a solution that rich people use to hide their money is that there are rich people in lots of countries and they have need to hide their money. And so in Italy, there's a really confusing structure, because this is how Italy works, is that you can set up a trust that has Italian law for all of the bits that aren't related to the trust, except for the trust bits, which can be English or Jersey law, which doesn't make any sense. And in France, there's one structure that's like a fiduciary structure that they've set up, and they get really angry if you call it a trust, but then they're also importing some bits of trust law anyway. And there's an international convention that's signed by maybe 12 countries on trust that I think starts to get at some of this. I think that there are interesting sort of unexplored uses of kind of trusts that go across borders, especially in countries where governments may be repressive and people may be running technology projects that maybe, or have data sets that are kind of put them at substantial personal risk. And so you could kind of conceive of a trust that, breaks projects up into pieces and breaks an encryption key up into pieces and hides each one in a trust in a different country, as a way to sort of prevent a really sensitive data set from being accessed. The sort of short version is it's hard and it's weird, but it may be getting better. So, all right, so the question is about incentivizing people to care about stuff, right? Okay. This stuff in particular. Okay, good. Other stuff I'm not as good at. I think that you're right. Like, there is a sort of incentive issue here. And my hunch, my suspicion is that you sort of have to attack it from 3 different angles, right? Like, one is from kind of a challenge to sort of mission-driven research and mission-driven programs, right? Like if you're really trying to do this and if you're really trying to achieve some sort of public purpose, right, then like this is the way to sort of further it even after you lose interest. The second is, I think, like directly from a financial incentive perspective, you need to make this inexpensive, right? Like you need to make this sort of like fire and forget. And so the idea that you could do this kind of archival cold storage for fractions of a penny per gigabyte, which is possible. Then you could say, well, put it in and then you can stop paying for it as soon as you lose interest, and then we'll hold on to it for a while, and it's relatively cheap to hold on to it. So like what you're paying for is not the sort of paying for it, for somebody to find a new home the instant we go away. You might be paying for it for somebody to hold on for another decade, right, until researchers come back around and decide they really need to look at this data again. And then the third, I think, is that you need to create and this is, I think, part of our mission as well, is like you need to create a culture where this is something that you just do, right? Like there are lots of default actions in an organization or a project. You get liability insurance for directors, right? You get liability insurance in case people slip and fall. They're just kind of the responsible practices. And so I think the point that we get to here is that this is a responsible practice.
So can you get the funders to, like if you put pressure on the funders to mandate this as part of giving a funding grant or something,
yeah,
would that help get it to be sort of normal required practice?
Yeah, I bet if you went through some foundation like grant histories and found how many times they funded the same type of project again and again and again and again, that might sort of turn the light on. And the foundation, they probably won't at this stage, but at some point they might consider actually being the fiduciaries of this project, right? The idea that I'm putting money into the world to make something happen and I should be responsible for it, other than just sort of hoping that it, learns to fly when I throw it out the nest.